Yes, I can see that.
Okay, excellent. So my name is Meg Smolinski, and Richard Jones is my colleague. He will be presenting today from Maryland Sustainable Ecologies. Richard is a board certified master arborist, and we'll be talking about urban tree care in DC. I am an ISA certified arborist, and I actually got my career started as a DC master gardener. I was interested in making the career switch. And so I took the Master Gardener program and learned a ton of information. And then several years later, I did the 2-year program at the Institute of Applied Agriculture at the University of Maryland, and then became a certified arborist 3 years ago. So without further ado, I'm going to let Richard take it away and begin our presentation for today.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today's talk is going to be about urban tree care. So what I thought we would do is start by going over some basics of components of a tree, and some of this may be review for you. Some of it may seem common knowledge, but I like to have everyone at sort of the same level. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. So we're going to go ahead and start on what is a tree. And if you could do the next slide, Meg.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of a technical difficulty.
No problem.
There we go.
So what is a tree? My father always described his philosophy class in college beginning with the question, what makes a door a door? And this is sort of a similar question, I feel. So, you know, it's one of those, well, we know what they look like. We think we know what they are. Let's look at a dictionary definition, okay? We'll go to the next one. This is a pretty standard definition, not too clear, but a woody perennial plant having a single, usually elongate main stem, generally with few or no branches on its lower part. What does that mean? Well, the important part is woody plant. Woody plants have significantly more lignin in them. They are not herbaceous. They do not tie back to the ground every year. But in terms of function and components, a shrub and a tree are the same. The only differences are generally how they've been pruned or how they've been trained, or naturally what their form is. Typically, shrubs are part of an understory layer or shrub layer, whereas trees, we generally anticipate them to be the overarching canopy. If we can go to the next one. All trees have 3 major components, of course, easily identifiable. The root system, which provides uptake of water and nutrients, as well as providing anchoring support for the tree. We have the trunk or stem, which is generally a storage for the tree's vascular system and providing structural support. Of course, this is where the lumber comes from. And finally, the crown, canopy, or branches, which are responsible for the collection of sunlight for photosynthesis, of course. If we can go to the next one. So all trees have a vascular system, just like you and I do. Their main components are a xylem, a phloem, and a cambium. A xylem is responsible for moving the water that gets absorbed by the roots. They move up into the tree. The phloem is another part of the vascular system that moves the sugars, the glucose that is created from photosynthesis, back down the tree. And the third layer is the cambium. The cambium actually separates the phloem and the xylem. The cambium is an area of meristematic tissue. When I say meristematic, think stem cells, non-differentiated cells that can be changed to become what the tree needs it to be, generally in terms of growth. If we can go to the next one, please. This will be another photo, again, just showing that same vascular system. The only part I would like to point out in this is that the xylem is composed of both sapwood, which is living cells that move water, and heartwood. Heartwood is actually dead cells. They are not actively moving water. They are simply there to provide structure for the tree. Often, a very old tree, particularly if it has decay in it, can decay from the interior out because, again, that is dead tissue on the interior, but it does provide some support. So, to visualize this on an actual stem, if we go to the next slide, you can actually see what the cambium looks like on a tree. If you take a branch, and you can do this on shrubs as well, of course, you scrape it with your thumbnail or a small pocket knife, you'll see this green layer underneath. That is the tree's vascular system. That is the healthy cambium layer. If it's in the winter and you're not sure if your plant is alive and it's a woody plant and you don't see the buds on it, you can run your finger on it. And if you see this cambium, well, you know that branch itself is alive at least. If we can go to the next one, please. An important thing to note when trees grow is that they extend from existing structure. Now, the way I like to visualize that is if you had an American beech tree, like this one that's been vandalized quite a bit, those letters that have been carved into the tree will never get higher up as the tree grows. The tree grows by extending from existing apical meristems. There's that word again, meristematic. This is a way I like to visualize that how a tree is growing. Those letters, again, carved into that soft bark beech, they do not get any higher in the tree. If we can go to the next one, please. What do trees need to live? Now, this recording, we're recording this, so you don't need to write this down. But the basics of what a tree needs to live, similar to most plants: carbon dioxide, of course, sunlight, water, some form of growing medium, normally soil. When you're dealing with trees, it's typically soil and not potting mix or anything else. You need macronutrients. When we're typically talking about fertilizer, this is what we're talking about: nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. The main macronutrients included in a fertilizer, but micronutrients also have their place. This can include iron, selenium, manganese, and if they're not present, that can cause issues in the tree's health. An important thing to remember is that trees do need oxygen in their rooting area. If a tree does not have oxygen around its roots, it can start to ferment. Anaerobic soils, that is, soils that do not have oxygen in them or sufficient oxygen, can lead to fermentation, bacterial growth, and fungal growth. So that's why we worry about compaction with trees. Correct soil pH. Generally, we're looking between 6 and 7. Now, that can be a little different from some of the other plants in your garden, which you are probably aware of what their pH requirements are. The reason it's critical with trees is if the tree does not have the correct pH, what micronutrients it can take up into the tree are suddenly no longer available. If the pH is not correct, those micronutrients are locked in the soil to that tree. It can't take them up. Finally, the correct growing environment, climate. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if we look on the next slide, this will be a very familiar map, I think, to probably all of you, a plant hardiness zone map. Where I'm in Maryland is we're typically in zone 7, 7B. So you have to be aware of that when you're selecting your plant material that you're going to plant. Will it become acclimated? Will it survive? Will it thrive in your area? An important thing to remember is if you're in a city, you can anticipate it being a little bit hotter because of the urban heat island effect. So you may have to take that into account. So again, and you'll hear me say this a lot, right tree, right place. If we can go to the next one, please. This is familiar, I'm sure, to everyone, but just a brief, we all probably know what photosynthesis is. Carbon dioxide and water with the energy from the sun creates glucose and oxygen. It's actually, unfortunately, a little more complicated than that, but that's as complicated as I'm going to get for this. If we can go on to the next slide, please. Now, how is a tree named? Well, if I showed you this photo of this tree with the leaves and the flower, you can get many different answers. That's because of common names. Common names are generally chosen by people to represent a tree, but they can vary quite a bit depending on the geographic location or what the person's background is. Some people will call this a tulip poplar, some people will call it a yellow poplar, and some people will call it a tulip tree. Tulip poplars are not poplar trees. The reason they have that common name, I believe, is because their lumber is similar in use to poplar, a true poplar. So that would be my guess where it got that name. And the tulip coming from that flower, oh, it looks like a tulip, we'll call it that. So the way you get more specific and more accurate and more consistent is to use a botanical or scientific name, the taxonomic name. This was what Linnaeus was always referring to things by. A botanical name can only refer to one species of tree, in this case, Liriodendron tulipifera. If you tell me that name, I know what tree you're referring to. However, if you say poplar tree, I'm going to ask a few follow-up questions. If we can go to the next one, please. Now, how long can a tree live? This is a photo of a bristlecone pine. We have evidence that those specimens can reach almost 5,000 years of age. If you're in Great Britain, they have oaks that reach 800 years of age, 1,000 years of age. If we have a tree that's lived for more than 200 years, we're pretty proud here in the States, I think, in this area. But what do we really look for in terms of life expectancy, and what do we really get? If we can go to the next one, please. Unfortunately, in the built environment, that is cities and suburbs, trees do not live anywhere near as long. This can be due to a combination of biotic, which is living, and abiotic, non-living factors. It's more often than not the abiotic, non-living factors. The average life of a street tree can only be expected to be 7 to 15 years, and that's normally it. And sometimes you'll see you only get 1 or 2 years out of them. Now, why is this? If we can go to the next one. This is an unfortunate common occurrence in many areas, particularly newer developments, if proper maintenance hasn't been considered. Relatively young, recently planted trees that have died quite quickly. Well, as I said, there are a number of reasons that this can happen, and we'll go over some of them. First and foremost is you really have to account for how much room a tree requires. A lot of people, when they think about a tree's root system, they have this impression of these deep roots that go 20 feet down into the ground. And aesthetically, we like the way that looks, but that's not accurate. Typically, the majority of a tree's roots are in the top 18 to 24 inches of soil. They provide for themselves by having very, very long, wide root systems. Often people look at the drip line of a tree, that is the very edge of its canopy, and say, oh, well, the roots probably end here. What you have to understand is in good soil, you can expect the roots to go 2 to 2.5 times beyond that drip line. Trees can need a significant amount of room, not only for their roots, but also for their canopy. If we can go to the next slide. This is an incredibly common issue in areas with sidewalks. It goes back to the tree was not given enough room when it was initially planted. It started off small, it got bigger. Well, if you visualize again how much you can expect that tree's roots to grow, and then try and put a barrier around it, like a sidewalk and a curb and a street, the tree is going to beat you. It's going to win because it's a lot more patient. It will very slowly break the sidewalk, break the curb, break the road. This generally requires a repair, generally requires cutting roots, causing damage to the tree. And the tree is, if it's healthy, going to immediately start working to lift that sidewalk back up and break that curb again. You'll notice on that tree that there are a lot of surface roots piling up. That is the tree trying to provide structure for itself when it doesn't have enough room to do so. Again, you have to think about the overall size of the tree, not when it's planted, but when it's mature. And if we go to the next one, you also have to consider its canopy. A lot of people plant trees too close to one another and don't consider the final canopy size for it. This is also an issue with utility lines, as you see here. Anytime trees are near utility lines, they have to be pruned back to protect and maintain that utility. This is actually a pretty good job of pruning this tree to make it work for the utilities. But again, a good visual of you have to consider how wide that canopy is going to be. You don't want to put an oak tree 2 feet from the edge of your house. You're going to have problems down the road. You again, think of what is the mature size of that tree and what does it need. If we can go to the next one, please. They need more water. Water is probably the most critical aspect of establishing a new tree. Often you get a situation like this. The trees have been planted. The contractor has put gator bags on them. That's what those green bags are at the bottom. And unfortunately, maybe it wasn't put in the contract or it fell through the cracks that, somebody has to come by and fill those bags and they have to check the soil moisture. Otherwise, trees that have been recently planted very quickly go into transplant shock and will generally die from lack of water. So really all you've done, unfortunately, is you've made nice little houses for spiders to live in when you put these gator bags on, but you don't maintain them. So water management can be really critical. Too much or too little water can kill a tree, and many of you may already know this. If we can go to the next one. Too little water, how about too much water? Well, often in our area of the country, we have very high clay content in our soil. Clay compacts very easily and does not particularly drain well. And if it's been compacted, it drains even poorly, more poorly than that. The issue with this is, you may remember I said we need to have oxygen in the root zone of the tree. Well, this is one of your main causes of tree death, is the water is not draining. The oxygen eventually gets depleted from the soil. You get fermentation, you get anaerobic bacteria, and generally you end up with a dead tree eventually. There are some trees that can tolerate poor drainage. There are trees that are accustomed to being in flood zones, so they have special components that allow them to thrive. And so really, if you're looking at planting a tree, you have to look at your site and match what will do best on that site. Otherwise, you're going to be replacing trees over and over again. Unfortunately, in the built environment, the soil you get is very low quality. It's often construction backfill. Sometimes you may have to look at replacement of that soil. Amendments were very popular some time ago, but we really are starting to understand that overall soil health may require a bit more drama than that. If we can go to the next, please. They need to be protected during construction. Simply put, all these trees are going to die, unfortunately. And again, this goes back to the conflict of infrastructure and trees. It's probably these trees were lifting up an old sidewalk and it was breaking it. And then you have a accessibility issue. So you have to repair that sidewalk. Maybe you have to run a whole new sidewalk. Well, all of the tearing and cutting of all these roots, not to mention that they've been allowed to dry out, means that these trees may not die immediately, but they will most likely die. It can take a tree up to 5 years to show the stress damage from construction. This not only includes cutting and tearing of roots, but also compaction. If you drive a truck or an excavator around the root zone of a tree, you'll most likely kill it or cause a fair amount of damage because you shear off the microscopic feeder roots and you've compacted the soil. So again, this is when you're at this stage, there's really not much you can do. What we try and do as arborists is get involved in the design and the early stages of a project like this and determine, okay, what can we do to improve accessibility and maybe protect those trees as well. If we can go to the next one, please. So planting a tree, I'm sure almost everybody here has done that. There are times where we see work that contractors have done and we kind of scratch our heads a little bit. The critical things with planting a tree is that you don't need to dig an incredibly deep hole. You only need to dig deep enough to get the root flare of that tree just above the existing grade. It's actually more important to dig a wider hole. You're trying to break up some of that compaction of the soil, make it easier for the tree's roots to go in. And a very critical thing is to not pile mulch on top of the tree. And I'm sure you all already know this. We call them mulch volcanoes. If you pile mulch at the base of a tree, you're holding heat and humidity against the tree, and you're going to encourage fungal growth. If we can go to the next one. This is just a photo to help you visualize where the root flare of a tree is. Root flare is simply where the trunk begins to flare out and it becomes those large structural roots. This tree was buried in a root ball up to the line above his finger. So inspecting plant material on your trees before they get planted can be really critical to making sure they thrive. If we can go to the next one, please. So you've probably heard arboriculture, you've probably heard urban forestry. What are they? What's the difference? Well, there's a fair amount of crossover between them. The simplest way to look at it is this. An arborist, someone who does arboriculture, focuses on one individual tree at a time. An urban forester, much like a forester, is concerned about the overall population of the trees, their overall health, their overall canopy cover. Now, both arborists and urban foresters generally receive a lot of the same training. They use a lot of the same tools. So there is a fair amount of crossover. Sometimes their job titles are even sometimes swapped in job postings I've found. But again, arborist, individual tree, one tree at a time, urban forester, what is the overall forest looking like? If we can go to the next one, please. So urban tree care, what are the first steps when a municipality or an arboretum wants to develop an urban tree care plan? Well, the first thing is they need to know what they have. Simplest way to do this is with a basic tree inventory. This is a photo of a simple street tree inventory. DC has a great deal of their trees already put into an inventory. If you go downtown around the Capitol, you can bring up, I believe it's through the Park Service, all of the trees that are in your area. Casey Trees, which I'll mention later, do a really good job of inventorying their trees. Now, what goes into that? If we can go to the next one. An inventory can be as complicated or as simple as you want it to be, as much information or as little as you want. But generally, the most basic information you need for a street tree inventory is what is the species of the tree, generally by the botanical name. What is the diameter? We typically measure trees in diameter. We can also measure their height, but typically diameter is a more industry accepted standard. We also want to know the general health of the tree. Is the tree dead? Is the tree declining? So with those three pieces of information, you can begin to put together a simple tree inventory. And this can often be done by trained volunteers. There are, of course, companies that will come out and do a tree inventory for you and set it up as complicated as you want. But certainly volunteers can do this. Students can do this. Homeowners can do this, with a simple dichotomous key like the photo on the left. It just takes time. If we can go to the next one. So canopy cover, you've probably heard this before. Canopy cover is quite simply any area that is shaded by a tree, anything that's under canopy. Most municipalities and nonprofits have goals for what they would like their canopy cover to be. It's often around 40%. State of Maryland looks for 40%. I believe KC Trees looks for 40%. The advantages of canopy cover include a variety of things, including reduced utility costs, mitigation of the urban heat island effect, which I mentioned earlier. Of course, habitat for wildlife. Wildlife normally needs longer, unbroken corridors of canopy, so we try and plan for that if we're trying to really encourage a lot of wildlife. Stormwater benefits by way of rain interception, and of course, aesthetics. I mean, I love living on a street lined with trees, and I think most people do. You can determine canopy cover by, using LiDAR if you want, or other remote sensing, or you can even estimate it in your home. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something called iTree software and how you would go about doing that if you wanted to do it yourself. If we can go to the next one. So iTree is a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service and many, many other groups, including KC Trees, Davy Tree, Bartlett Tree. And what it is a software suite that is free to the public. Let me start off by pointing that out. It's typically can be run in your browser, but certain tools typically need to be downloaded. It can be found at itreetools.org. And it offers a lot of great ways to analyze the benefits of trees. If we can go to the next slide, please. So if we wanted to determine canopy cover, so this is my street, Jacob's Ladder, up in Columbia, Maryland. And let's say I want to determine how much canopy cover I have on my street in my neighborhood. Well, I bring up iTree, and the first thing it asks me to do, if we can go to the next one, is to delineate or mark off the area that I'm trying to determine. So I'd made that sort of polygon you see on the left. And then all it simply does is generates a crosshair. And every time it does that, it asks you, is this a tree? Is this an area under canopy cover? Or is it not? As you continue to do this using the Google Map base layer, you will eventually begin to put together a fairly accurate representation of what your canopy cover is. For my street, I think that turned out to be around 70% with a standard error. I believe it was around 3 or 4, maybe a bit more than that. The more times you collect data, of course, that standard error goes lower and you can feel a little more confident. You are clicking a lot of times though. This was probably 300-400 mouse clicks to do this. But you'll also notice that it is estimating the tree benefits in terms of carbon sequestration, air pollution mitigation, rainwater interception. And so that can be a good way to get a sense of what your local canopy cover is doing for you. If we can go to the next one, please. So now I'm going to talk briefly about another section of iTree, which is called My Tree. So this is a white oak, a Quercus alba, that is in my front yard. It's about 25 inches in diameter. And so by entering in some information on that, including my local area, my tree generated this sort of nutritional value of the tree, basically. I think they wanted to make it look like that. Again, telling you carbon dioxide sequestered, stormwater avoided, air pollution. Again, another way to visualize what that tree is doing for you without just thinking about what are the aesthetics or what is the lumber value of my tree. Here's everything else that it's doing for us. And that's important to keep in mind. If we can go to the next one, please. Now, when you want to plan out plantings in an urban area, that's fairly complicated. That's because so many of our infrastructure, so many of our utilities are underground. And we have to, again, consider the full size of our trees. Will they conflict or damage our infrastructure? When we have to repair or replace utilities, will we have to damage the tree? And how can we be safe when planting as well? We don't want anybody to have an accident while we're digging to plant a tree. It's always important to notify your local, in Maryland, we have Miss Utility. You call 811. All of the utility companies come out and mark the locations of their utilities. Very important. You don't want to accidentally hit an electrical line. You don't want to accidentally hit a gas line. Years ago, I may have knocked out the power to a country club. So it's very important, to, get those utilities marked. If we can go to the next one, please. We want to avoid monocultures. And this can be kind of difficult when we think of the aesthetics of, well, I want that street lined with nothing but American elms. It looks so pretty. Well, the problem is when you only have one type of tree or just a few species, you have a monoculture. If you get a specific pest or pathogen that feeds on that specific tree you planted, you are going to have a lot of problems, which is what many cities have learned, unfortunately. Chestnut blight was one of the first big ones, wiping out the chestnut trees. So what do? We replanted the areas with elm trees and ash trees. And again, another monoculture. Then emerald ash borer has been wiping out the ash trees, and Dutch elm disease has been putting a hurt on the elm trees. So we want to really try to not repeat ourselves over and over again by planting those monocultures. Now, how can we do that? If we go to the next one, please. In the industry, we have the 10-20-30 rule. And this comes back to botanical names and taxonomy and Linnaeus. It always goes back to Linnaeus. So what we try and do, and this is not a hard rule, we try and follow it. And if we can go beyond it, we do. You never want to plant more than 30% of trees from the same family. Now, if you look on that chart on the right, family is 2 above species. You never want to plant more than 20% of the same genus. In this case, that's Quercus, oak. And you never want to plant more than 10% from the same species. Quercus robur, the English oak. And again, this can be difficult. The imagery, the aesthetics of a street lined with all the same London plains, these beautiful allays that we always see and want to mimic. You can have them, but you have to have the maintenance programs in place, and you have to be willing, if you get a specific pest, to replace every one of them. It's a risk. If we can go to the next one, please. Tree equity is something we've started recently looking at. The American Forests Foundation has really taken the lead on this. In terms of tree equity, we're talking about equality in access to canopy cover. So I was born in Georgetown Hospital, and I grew up in Springfield, Virginia. So this is a map of sort of the Springfield, Virginia, Fairfax County area. American Forest has been putting these tree equity scores together, and I encourage you to take a look. They're adding data slowly. They're primarily major city centers. And it can give you an idea along economic and racial lines. Are we being equal in how we plant trees? Are we being equal in how we distribute the maintenance money for those trees? Because that's very important as well. If we can go to the next one, please. And we can't forget maintenance. I just said that. Often we get plenty of volunteer events, plenty of monies for planting trees, for designing streets, but maintenance isn't always included, and that's a major problem. Never, never, never let anyone tell you a tree is maintenance free, particularly if they say it's a native tree, or it's native to the state, or it's an ornamental tree. No tree is maintenance free. And again, you have to consider what is its full size going to be, what will be the requirements so it's not hitting buildings, what pruning will need to be done, what will be eventual removal costs or plant health care costs. You have to incorporate all of that because again, we're trying to avoid that photo on the left. And the photo on the right to me is somehow even worse, where you have younger trees just planted and you're tearing them out of the ground within the next year or so because maintenance wasn't included. And so that's very critical when you're looking at city budgets. If we can go to the next one, please. I know you're all tired of me saying that phrase. I only have a few more times to say it. So can infrastructure, can utilities, can trees, can they coexist in a city? With proper design, planning, and involving everyone on the design team, your civil engineers, excuse me, your civil engineers, your arborists, your city planners, your stakeholders, you can have something similar to the photo on the left that's called a silvocell. That is a designed space to allow for root growth without damaging sidewalks, without having surface roots creating trip hazards. And on the right is what one of those systems looks like when the tree is being installed. It's sort of similar to a suspended sidewalk. It is not cheap, and it has to be included from the beginning if you're going to make it work. But the long-term impact is you probably will have healthier trees. You probably will have less damage to your infrastructure and your utilities. And so overall, long-term, that's a real great benefit. So it's something we've been encouraging more and more. And it all goes back to the design process when you're laying out, when you're doing this planning of new urban areas or revitalization of areas. If we can go to the next one, please. Finally, I've mentioned them several times. I'm sure you are all familiar with them. If you're not, please check out Casey Trees. They're a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. They are really on the cutting edge on a lot of urban tree care, on replanting, reforesting city centers. They have a lot of wonderful free classes on how to be a citizen forester, how to identify trees. They have, you may already know, lots of planting events. As we slowly return to normal, probably more and more of those will be kicking into gear because we're all looking to catch up on our planting goals. So I really encourage you to take a look at caseytrees.org. Really a wonderful group of people. If we can go to the next one. So that ends my part of the presentation with some time for questions. Of course, I think we did okay on time, but if we'd like to turn it back over to Meg or Patricia, and we can start looking at some questions.
All right, thank you so much, Richard. This is Meg again, and if anyone would like to enter questions into the chat, we can go ahead and answer some questions there.
And if I don't know the answer to it, I will try and direct you to who might know the answer to it. So this question from Annie is about soil amendments generally being the norm and what is recommended now. Primarily, the main recommendation is to determine a tree that can do well in that soil structure that you have. Soil texture is composed of sand, silt, and clay in some ratio. So by selecting a tree that will do well in that heavy clay or poorly draining soil, you may have better luck. Can you amend soil? Of course you can, but what you have to realize is that is not a fast process at all. When we're talking about repairing soil profiles from construction damage, from compaction, we're talking about 20, 30, 40 years down the road. It can be done. And of course, I do encourage some soil amendments. Biochar is becoming quite popular. Some people are adding more mycorrhizae inoculants into their soil. So I don't want to say, no, don't amend at all. I'm just saying that you have to be willing to work at it for a long time. Often with very heavily damaged, compacted soils, we're looking at, probably ripping the soil, bringing in heavy equipment to really try and break up the compaction and slowly rebuild that soil structure. So now we have a question about the initials carved in the bark. As the tree grows, it does, as you mentioned, it grows up and then it puts on existing diameter. So you do get a little bit of stretching as the tree adds on cork and cork cambium. Those are components of the bark. And yes, as the tree continues to grow, the if I remember correctly, the phloem does eventually continue to extend out. I don't know if it eventually converts into xylem, though. That's a very good question. I'll have to take a look at that. Or if it simply is pushed out by the tree. That's an excellent question, Chris. I'll have to take a look at that. How do you determine what nutrients a tree needs and how often you need to check them? Before planting a tree, or really any large garden renovation, you want to take a soil sample if you can. Here in Maryland, there are local labs, and I'm sure there are in DC, possibly attached to the university, where you can send in a sample of the soil that you plan to plant into, and they will prepare, sometimes for a fee, a report of what the nutrient content of that soil is, what the micronutrients are, and they'll sometimes give you some recommendations on what you should do, what might be lacking. We don't typically recommend just, oh, we'll just go throw fertilizer out there and you'll be fine. Well, you really need to know what you need. So one, you're not wasting money. Two, you're not causing unnecessary fertilizer runoff. And three, you're really providing, I already said that, you're providing what the tree needs. You can also, if a tree is struggling, have a tree company do what's called a foliar nutrient analysis. They take leaf samples and they send them to their lab, and they can determine what's deficient from that. They'll probably also take a pH sample because, as I said, if the soil pH is not correct for that specific species, again, typically between 6 and 7, you are going to get nutrients that may be in the soil but unavailable to that tree. So again, that's very critical. And correcting soil pH issues is, again, unfortunately, a very long process because of the buffering capacity of the soil. It takes a lot to change the pH of the soil. It takes a lot of time. What are the best trees to plant in DC? So I get asked a lot of, well, what is a bulletproof tree? And unfortunately, there is no bulletproof tree. What I typically recommend is you want to see how far away from buildings you're going to be. If you don't have a lot of room, if you're within, say, 20 feet of a building, consider looking at, smaller ornamentals such as your crepe myrtles and your red buds, or your service berries, which can provide year-round interest. They can provide forage for animals. Service berry, if you can beat the birds to it, they provide wonderful berries. If you have, the room, you have the budget, you have the soil and the airspace for it, willow oaks do quite well in our area. They don't seem to be affected by as many pathogens as other oaks. But again, you have to really look at your specific site. I can tell you what you don't want to plant typically in streets are sweet gums, unless you get what's called rotundiloba. Sweet gums produce those spiky seed pods. We call them gum balls. They can be a tripping hazard. DC really tries to not have female ginkgo trees because of the fruit they create, makes a slip hazard. So again, there are probably local recommendations as well you can follow, and your local extension service can also provide some help with that.
And I will interrupt to say
next
that
question is,
Casey Trees has a great site about street trees, and I'm going to put that link in the chat right now for everyone.
Wonderful, thank you, Meg. Do big established trees need feeding? Again, this depends on a soil test. Now, each tree expert company has their own sort of proprietary, cure-all, and it's normally a mix of macronutrients, mycorrhizal inoculants, and maybe some biochar. But again, typically, if the tree is in good quality soil, you don't typically need to fertilize a tree. if you have grass around that tree, you're really typically only fertilizing the grass anyways when you're trying to feed the tree. Grass roots react much quicker to nutrient availability than tree roots do. So typically the grass tends to beat out the tree, takes all the nutrients for itself, and your grass starts looking great, but the tree may not get it. Again, you really want to have a soil test done or a foliar analysis done on that tree. But they can be, of course, fertilized if there is a deficiency. How do I advise removing honeysuckle that has invaded trees? If we're talking about any type of vines, any type of invasive vines, your oriental bittersweets, kudzu, or poison ivy, which isn't invasive but still goes up there. You want to cut them at the base. Often, if you are comfortable using herbicides, we typically recommend that you paint the cut quickly with an herbicide. You don't have to use an herbicide if you don't want to, but we don't recommend ripping them out of the tree. The reason being, a lot of vines have these aerial roots that latch on to the tree's bark, and if you go and try and rip them down, you'll probably strip some of the bark off that tree and cause a wound to it. So generally, if it's not too terrible of a invasion of them, we normally recommend cutting at the base and, if applicable, applying an herbicide to the cut to help control them. Next question is about mulching or creating new mulch rings. An existing tree, it's often cut with spades, and yes, you can cause some root damage when you cut that ring around the tree. Now, what you could do, and you don't want to do this all at once, is you could go in, string trim down that grass, and then pile hardwood mulch on top of it. Some of the grass will get through. If the tree has not been there too long, you can cut the sod out and then replace it with hardwood mulch. We tend to normally say hardwood mulch as opposed to the typical triple shredded dyed mulch that a lot of people get. That's okay, but fresh, I'm sorry, not fresh, but wood chips are a very effective mulch and can help be a barrier. Unfortunately, you will have to periodically go back out and pull weeds or grass. Some companies will clear the area with an herbicide first, but again, that's your own personal comfort and what the requirements are for herbicide use. I apologize, I seem to have shifted the chat around. Which trees are recommended under power lines to avoid drastic trimming? Typically, I'm under BG&E where I live. Pepco is a big provider. They're all Exelon. They typically, when they have to do removals, they are looking to replant. They give you a list, and it's generally what I've mentioned. It's redbuds, it's crepe myrtles, it's serviceberry, Japanese tree lilac. These are trees that they can get tall, but they won't get 50 feet tall. So you won't have the issue of you planted this tree and then your great grandchildren have to talk to a utility work planner who says he has to cut half of it off to protect the utility line. So that's typically what they recommend. Smaller ornamental trees, generally in that situation. Something that I wish more of the general population knew about trees. I've sort of covered it already, but it's that trees don't need to be planted really close to one another. Often in street tree plantings, you see trees planted 6 to 12 feet apart from one another, and they're not going to thrive. But go into Central Park and look at the elms that are 40 to 80 feet away from one another, and they're still alive. I think that's an important thing when we look at design, and to understand that, yeah, they have to start out small and you have to let them grow. So don't try and fill in with all of these other trees and then cause all these maintenance issues or all these trees that are competing with one another and not thriving. If a tree has suckers at the bottom, are there other interventions? It depends on the species of the tree. Certain trees want to be shrubs. That's and they will very strongly sucker at the base. Certain ornamental cherries sometimes do this from time to time. They just want to be shrubs for some reason. What I really recommend, and sometimes landscape contractors don't know this, you can cut the suckers off. Never treat them with an herbicide because it's a shared root system with the tree. You are giving the tree a dose of Roundup if you spray those suckers you just cut. Sometimes suckers, or if they're higher up in the tree, we call them water spouts, can indicate that the tree is activating dormant buds due to a loss of canopy. For instance, if the tree was topped by somebody who didn't know how to prune correctly, or if the top of it broke out during a storm, that hormonal imbalance in the tree causes these dormant buds to activate. And that means the tree is having a pretty big stress response. It's trying to save itself by putting out a flush of foliage. But again, that's not always the case. Sometimes, depending on the species, they just want to be shrubs. You can cut the suckers back. But if you suddenly see a lot of water spouts in a tree, that can indicate a pretty major health issue. For instance, an ash tree that's been attacked by emerald ash borer will start to have epicormic growth, the water spouts, the suckers growing out of it. Thank you for the link, Meg. So typically, yes, that is a good question. Are you stuck with them for the long haul? Sometimes you are. If they are really extensively up in that tree, you could potentially have a tree company send a bucket truck up or a tree climber, see if they've started to decay enough to where they're loose and they can prune them out of there. They could probably certainly prune the loose vines. But some of them can last a very long time. I have some English ivy around an oak tree I cut about 6 years ago, and a lot of it's still there. And I'm just really resisting the urge to tear them down. But yes, unfortunately, sometimes you do have to wait a little. So the next question is about risk and benefits for free municipal mulch that can carry invasive plant parts, disease that can regrow. So often, if it's from a reputable source, now I don't specifically know the source you're referring to, oftentimes if mulch has been generated with material that's been treated with herbicides, there is a risk that that herbicide may still be present. Compost that has not reached a correct temperature can have weed seeds in it that may germinate with invasive plants, particularly plants that have a long seed bank, Japanese stiltgrass, things like that. Unfortunately, it tends to be a case-by-case basis, but I do know local municipalities that do a very great job. I mean, College Park in Maryland, they have a good program. It's unfortunately a case-by-case basis. The same is true with a lot of amendments in compost. You really need to do a little research to see what you're getting. Oftentimes with compost, they'll give you a nutritional analysis, a fertility analysis of it. And that's something that you should look for, because otherwise, as you say, you may not know what you're getting.
Richard, it's about 6:56 now, so I think maybe just 2 more questions and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Okay, all right. So a row of trees used for screening to avoid single species problem. So screening can always be a bit tricky. It was very popular years ago to just plant Leland cypress and just plant Leland cypress, and they do pretty well in our area. I'd recommend intermingling different types of conifers that do well in that type. You can include a lot of arborvitae. You can include, depending on your soil conditions, maybe some dawn redwoods, well, bald cypress wouldn't be the best for screening, but but again, there are quite a lot. If you look at plant nurseries, they'll have whole sections devoted to screening areas where they've trained, developed, cultivated conifers that do a good job of that. But typically, we try and avoid only Leland cypress, only white pine, again, to avoid that monoculture. And white pines don't really do too well in our area in the first place. So last question I'll get is about topping trees. Is not good for the tree. Topping trees is also sometimes called a heading cut. There are occasional times where a heading cut can be used, particularly in a tree that's had the top already broken out and a bad stub, a torn stub is left. But again, and I'll also mention pollard pruning, which is a feature of formal gardens, actually is intentional topping of a tree, but it requires the maintenance follow-up to take care of the growth, the epicormic, the suckers that grow as a result of that. It can be done. Some formal gardens do it, but you have to maintain them. Occasionally you will see landscape contractors top crepe myrtles as well. We call that crepe murder when they do it, but they seem somewhat tolerant of that. But in general, a large established shade tree, if you remove more than 25% of its living foliage, you've probably killed that tree. So we really stress, unless it's correcting a previous damage to the tree, we don't typically try and do that. Occasionally with conifers, they'll do that. With pines. If a utility contractor is really trying to protect a utility but not cut down the whole tree, with your permission, they'll generally do that for you. But you have to be aware that's typically not industry standard. Okay. Sorry if I didn't get to everybody's questions.
There were a lot of questions. Thank you everyone for participating, for coming, for all of your questions. Thank you, Richard and Meg, for putting this together. It was really very informative. And with all of the questions and all of the interest at the end, I feel like maybe we could even have gone on for a longer session or a follow-up session. So thank you so much. This was really great. The session is being recorded. We're gonna put it up on the UDC. We're going to create a channel for the UDC Master Gardener series. So I'll put the link up and share it with you guys next week in my weekly email. Thanks everybody so much. Any final words, Richard and Meg?
Oh, thank you for having us.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I'm gonna turn off the recording. Thanks for coming and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.